So in Angular, when you have a host binding or an event binding on a particular template element, if you return false from that event handler, Angular will automatically prevent the default on the associated event for the event handler. And one caveat when you do this is that if you have multiple event handlers listening to the same event on the same element, sibling event handlers won't see this change take place until all of the event handlers have been executed on that particular element for that particular event. So to demonstrate this, I have a simple demo in which I have a container here, and then I have two children. And you can see in each of the children, I have two click handlers. The first click handler is going to take the event and prevent the default behavior in two different approaches. One is going to be using the implicit return false, and one is going to be using an explicit prevent default method call. I then have a second click handler on each of these that essentially just looks at the event to see if it can detect whether or not that default behavior has been prevented. So if we look down here at handle child, and this is going to be the first event handler that changes the behavior, and you can see if I'm passing in explicit, I call event.preventDefault explicitly, and if I don't pass in explicit, I'm using that return false to get Angular to implicitly call event.preventDefault under the hood. And then here is my second event handler, and all I'm doing here is looking at that event to see if I can detect whether or not that default behavior has been prevented. And then just to show how the event bubbles up on the container, I do the same thing. I take the event and I look to see whether or not the default behavior has been prevented. And that one's just at the container level. So let's jump over to the browser here and take a look. I'll refresh to make sure we have the right code. Just as a control case, if we do nothing, you can see at the container, there is no default prevented or anything because we haven't touched the event anyway. Anyway, that's just a control case. So first, let's look and see what happens if we use the return false approach to have Angular implicitly call prevent default for us. In this case, so we have our first event handler. You can see I'm doing the return false. And in this case, the sibling click handler on the same element for the same event does not see that that default behavior has been prevented. Default prevented is false. However, when that event bubbles up through the DOM to the container, you can see at that point the default behavior has been prevented on that particular event. And again, that's because when we use the return false behavior of the host binding, Angular won't call prevent default until all of the event handlers for a particular event on this particular element have been executed. So in this case, it's not actually calling prevent default until both my first click handler and my second click handler have both been invoked, which is why the sibling is not seeing the change in time. Now, if we compare that to explicitly calling event.preventDefault in the click handler, right? So here's the first click handler, we're calling event.preventDefault. And in this case, you can see in the sibling click handler on the same element that default behavior has been prevented. So in this case, again, sibling is prevent defaulted true, as opposed to in the previous approach where prevent default is false. And of course, in both cases, by the time the event bubbles up through the DOM to the container, we can see that the default behavior has been prevented. Now, you may say that this is kind of a moot point because Angular, I don't believe, makes any explicit guarantees about the order in which these event handlers will actually fire. In my experience, they fire in the order in which they are defined. Most people maybe not even know that you can apply multiple event handlers to the same event on the same element like this. In this case, I'm doing explicit click handlers. This could also be applied if, say, you have multiple directives being applied to the same element that each have an event handler of the same type. But again, it may be a sticky situation to try and determine which order these will fire in. So for the vast majority of people, this return false versus event.preventDefault may hold no intrinsic value. However, if you get down into the weeds and you need to hack something together like a polyfill, which is what I've been working on, then this kind of caveat becomes important to understand.